In his letter to the Ephesians, St. Paul uses the image of the church as the bride of Christ. So the church personified as a woman, often as a bride, is common in many church documents and writings of the saints. Usually these images of the church as the bride of Christ emphasize the divine aspects of the church, probably because the image of a bride in reference to the human aspects of the church quickly runs in distasteful directions. However, a vision of St. Hildegard of Bingen qualifies as an exception. She writes, quote, "I had a vision of a woman of such beauty that the human mind is unable to comprehend. She stretched in height from earth to heaven. Her face shone with exceeding brightness, and her gaze was fixed on heaven. She was dressed in a dazzling robe of white silk and draped in a cloak, adorned with stones of great price. On her feet she wore shoes of onyx, but her face was stained with dust. Her robe was ripped down the right side, her cloak had lost its sheen of beauty, and her shoes had been blackened. And she herself, in a voice loud with sorrow, was calling to the heights of the heavens, saying, 'Hear, heaven, how my face is sullied. Mourn, earth, that my robe is torn. Tremble, abyss, because my shoes are blackened. My bridegroom's wounds remain fresh and open as long as the wounds of men's sins continue to gape.'" End quote. In Hildegard's image of a distressed, beautiful woman, the paradoxical glory of the moral personhood of the church is potently symbolized. In 2010, Pope Benedict XVI reflected on that same image of Hildegard's in relation to the sexual abuse of minors in the church by saying, quote, "In the vision of St. Hildegard, the face of the church is stained with dust, and this is how we have seen it. Her garment is torn by the sins of priests. The way she saw and expressed it is the way we have experienced it. We must accept this humiliation as an exhortation to truth and a call to renewal. Only the truth saves. We must ask ourselves what we can do to repair as much as possible the injustice that has occurred. We must ask ourselves what was wrong in our proclamation and our whole way of living the Christian life to allow such a thing to happen. We must discover a new resoluteness in faith and in doing good. We must be capable of doing penance. We must be determined to make every possible effort in priestly formation to prevent anything of the kind from happening again." End quote. Alongside Benedict XVI, let's ponder the bridal image of the church as a beautiful woman in a dirtied, torn dress. We just wanted to hop in quick to tell you about our new audio documentary.
Have you ever trusted someone deeply only to discover that they weren't who you thought they were?
That's what happened to us.
In Descent into Light, we share our story of spiritual abuse and how we walked through shock, grief, and betrayal toward a hope I didn't think was possible.
It's raw, it's real, and it's for anyone who's ever wrestled with faith and doubt.
Search Descent into Light wherever you get your podcasts or visit sistersofthelittleWay.com.
With this startling image in mind, we're going to explore what authentic reform might look like in a church that for decades has been inundated with revelations of the sexual abuse of minors and adults and the subsequent cover-ups. In order to explore reform in the church in light of the abuse crisis, we'll first return to the thought of then Cardinal Joseph Ratzinger. In a lecture given to the Communion and Liberation movement, Joseph Ratzinger juxtaposed two forms of reform in the church. He first describes what he calls self-made reform, a reform based on human action, self-sufficiency, and projects. He writes, quote, "A self-made church is reduced to the empirical domain and thus precisely as a dream comes to nothing," end quote. Ratzinger argues that this mode of reform reduces human action to the empirical realm and results in an amputation that severs the human person from God and imprisons her entirely in the empirical realm. Ratzinger argues that a church operating from this idea of reform will limit the nature of its reform by merely adding on programs, institutions, and projects rather than removing what he calls subsidiary constructions. True reform, on the other hand, is a removal rather than an addition. Ratzinger uses an analogy taken from St. Bonaventure of a sculptor to describe true reform. Just as a sculptor reveals his or her work through removal or ablatio, so too the church's true identity is revealed through the process of removal. Authentic renewal for Ratzinger therefore entails the removal of what is not truly part of the church in the first place. This ablatio process, Ratzinger argues, is the only true reform in the church because it bypasses the vertical amputation that occurs in self-made reform, thus opening the church to grace and freedom. He says, quote, "Reform is ever renewed ablatio, or removal, whose purpose is to allow the nobilis forma, or the countenance of the bride, and with it the bridegroom himself, the living Lord, to appear." Such ablatio or negative theology is a path to something wholly positive. This path allows the divine to penetrate, where the eye is no longer pitted against the eye and self against self, end quote. For each new age in the church, ablatio reform, according to Ratzinger, must be developed and applied in light of the reality of the present moment. Ratzinger writes, quote, "The essential basis of church order constantly needs to be developed and applied concretely so that the church's life can unfold in a particular moment. This particular moment in church history is marked by two major developments that impact reform in the church. First, more than 40 years ago, reports of sexual abuse emerged in Canada and the United States, and then in 2002, public reaction erupted with the spotlight reports in the Boston Globe. The abuse crisis confronted the church with the darkness of an evil within her that made many of her members shudder in disgust and turn away, some to never return. Then around the same time, digital technology began to fundamentally change the way that people interacted with the church. In an age of transparency and accessibility never before possible, digital technology, married to the revelation of horrific abuse in the church, led to a groundswell of demand for reform, a demand that the hierarchy and internal structures and institutions of the church were not really prepared to meet. After the first wave of revelations of abuse in the United States, measures and programs were eventually put in place to protect against abuse, especially the abuse of children. Though various programs and protections are definitely positive developments toward reform, in view of Ratzinger's ablatio reform, these changes, though obviously needed, don't even begin to address the profound reform that is necessary. True reform for Ratzinger would necessarily involve identifying and removing the practices, attitudes, and aspects of church environments that allow abuse and its subsequent cover-up to occur in the first place. Rather than simply adding more scaffolding in the church, Ratzinger's model of reform exhorts us to begin to remove the dirt that obscures her face. Given that the church in need of reform today is immersed in a digital world, let's consider the thought of Canadian philosopher and media theorist and practicing Catholic Marshall McLuhan. In light of the digital reality, McLuhan provides an interesting and vital expansion on Ratzinger's thought. And perhaps even more interestingly, Ratzinger and McLuhan use similar language and concepts. Ratzinger in reference to false church reform, and McLuhan in reference to the reality of living in a technological world. I've already discussed a concept that Ratzinger raises in relation to false church reform, that of amputation. So now let's think about McLuhan, because he uses the same term. Amputation for Ratzinger is the removal of what is essential to the human person. We amputate ourselves, he writes, when we try to, quote, squeeze the world into the empirical realm. For Ratzinger, amputation occurs only in the negative. It cuts off the human person from grace and from God, which leads to false reform in the church. McLuhan proposes a concept of amputation that's different from that of Ratzinger. Amputation for McLuhan is a given reality of modern life and human experience. Every time we extend a human function beyond ourselves through technology, McLuhan argues that amputation occurs. McLuhan uses the example of the wheel to illustrate his point. The wheel for McLuhan is an amputation or an extension of the human foot. In the case of the wheel, as an extension of the foot, The pressure of new burdens resulting from the acceleration of exchange by written monetary media was the immediate occasion for the extension or amputation of this function from our bodies. So the wheel, as a counter-irritant to increased burdens, in turn brings about a new intensity of action by its amplification of a separate or isolated function. So the foot in rotation. The wheel, as a counter-irritant to increased burdens, in turn brings about a new intensity of action by its amplification of a separate or isolated function, the feet in rotation. Human culture, according to McLuhan, continually produces technology in response to various irritants. Our busyness and need to travel faster, for instance, led to the invention of the wheel. As a result, the wheel, as a counter-irritant, brought about a sort of amputation in the human experience. Amputations of the human body that result from technological advances, McLuhan argues, leads to an experience of numbness. So let's go back to the wheel example. We experience the intense movement of wheels as an extension of our own feet. And this amplification is bearable by the nervous system only by numbing ourselves or blocking our perception. According to McLuhan, the numbness that a person experiences creates a situation similar to the myth of Narcissus. The youth Narcissus mistook his own reflection in the water for another person. This extension of himself by a mirror numbed his perceptions until he became the servo mechanism of his own extended or repeated image. The nymph Echo tried to win his love with fragments of his own speech, but in vain. He was numb. He had adapted to his extension of himself, and he had become a closed system. As technology becomes faster and more advanced, McLuhan argues that what is amputated and extended in the human person becomes more and more interior. He compares electric technology, or what is now digital technology, to extending and numbing our central nervous system. And as a result, he dramatically concludes, quote, "In the electric age, we wear all of mankind as our skin," end quote. Though Ratzinger speaks of amputation in a different way, it's clear that the resulting self-enclosed ways of relating to the world in both McLuhan and Ratzinger's concept of amputation are actually quite similar. In Ratzinger's thought, this numbness and the closed system it creates plays itself out in full-free form in the self-made church, where self is pitted against self. He says, quote, "A mirror that reflects only itself is no longer a mirror. A window that no longer lets us see the wide open spaces outside, but gets in the way of the view, has lost its reason for being," end quote. For McLuhan, this way of relating to the world is inherent in any world infused with technological advances that lead to amputation. So fusing both of these insights, one could say that today we find ourselves experiencing a situation of possible double amputation and numbness. Even if one were unfamiliar with Ratzinger and McLuhan's concepts of amputation, the description of today's church as consisting of numbed out, amputated selves pitted against selves seems pretty apt. First, we find the technological amputation of self in an environment of countless irritants and counter-irritants that lead to numbing behavior. Then we also find a self-made church that bars herself from the supernatural, not necessarily in the proclamation of her beliefs, but in her members' way of acting, especially in the digital world. If we look at the behavior of many members of the church, of all tribes and stripes, we see countless Narcissuses before pools of water gazing upon themselves as if in a mirror. We see closed systems of selves speaking to amputated selves. We see a church enveloped in the narcotic, dissociative effect of amputation, unaware of how speaking within these closed systems, especially online for all to see, creates more scandal than converts. The church online, which in truth is the church today, because the world of today lives in an environment of the digital, doesn't realize it's wearing all of mankind on her skin. We're amputated and numbed, both by the effects of technology and also often by the self-enclosed way that many of us act in the church. As a result, reform in the church, and therefore the effective proclamation of the gospel, is threatened. Both Ratzinger's and McLuhan's observations help us to see how the church faces some rather extreme obstacles as we try to engage in authentic reform and renewal. Interestingly, as we have explained, both of these thinkers articulate these obstacles similarly in terms of amputation and the resulting numbness that occurs. Perhaps even more fascinating, both McLuhan and Ratzinger also propose similar solutions, or at least ways to tunnel out of this numbing experience of amputation. Wonder, Ratzinger proposes, is the antidote to the prison of amputation. He writes, quote, "True wonder is a no to this confinement in the empirical, this worldly reality. It prepares man for an act of faith, which opens him to the horizon of the eternal and the infinite." McLuhan has a similar beginning point for escape from amputation and its resulting numbness, or at least awareness of its effects: the artist. For McLuhan, the artist is not literally a person who practices fine arts, but instead is a person in any field, scientific or humanistic, who grasps the implications of his actions and of the new knowledge in his time, the person of integral awareness. For McLuhan, the artist possesses the means of anticipating and avoiding the consequences of technological trauma. McLuhan does not attribute the special prophetic ability of the artist to grace, but similar to Ratzinger's wanderer, one could say that both the artist and the wanderer have the ability to see more deeply into reality and beyond enclosed systems, both technological and ecclesial, to discover possibilities for change. Because Ratzinger's wanderer and McLuhan's artist can move beyond the amputation of a self-enclosed church and the amputative narcotic effect present in today's digital world, they both have the eyes to see how the church can be truly reformed. So in order to engage in reform, the church needs wanderers and artists because they help us to see beyond our amputative states in order to see what truly needs to be amputated from the church. But are we cultivating artists and wanderers in the subcultures of our church? Or are we amputating our artists and our wanderers from the body of Christ instead of what really needs to be amputated? Survivors of all forms of abuse in the church are a group of modern-day wanderers and artists, and they're often amputated from church life simply because their voices and their experiences are inconvenient. However, precisely because of their experiences, survivors of abuse see more deeply into reality, and they can help us to identify the attitudes and the structures in the church that need to change. But are we listening to them? Or do we tunnel out of our self-enclosed echo chambers of numbness in order to listen to wanderers and artists among us? How can we become wanderers and artists ourselves? In answer to these questions, let's conclude by pointing to the first oblatio that is required in reform in the church. And that is one that is personal, embarking on the lifelong task of our own kenosis. Rather than insulating ourselves in closed systems of selves speaking to amputated selves, the gospel calls us to pour ourselves out in self-gift and Christ-like kenosis. We do this while daring to trust that self-emptying is the paradoxical way to Christian wholeness. This spirituality of personal oblatio recognizes that we have attachments, opinions, and desires that stand in the way of the removal of what is non-essential, both to our own identity and to the identity of the church. So rather than clinging to the way that we see the church and others, personal kenosis calls us to release our grasp on the non-essential aspects of our faith to which we cling, so that we can see and be in the church more like Christ. But I'm not going to conclude there, because as members of the church who have experienced abuse will tell you, many spiritual concepts, including that of kenosis, are often weaponized by abusive people, communities, and subcultures within the church. So in order for personal kenosis to truly lead to reform in the church, we must be able to empty ourselves in Christ-like kenosis freely and not under any form of abusive coercion. I'm going to conclude with that inconvenient truth and that final prick of the church's conscience in imitation of the voices of wanderers and artists among us. Just when we think we've solved a problem in the church, wanderers and artists continue the conversation. Their voices are disruptive, they're irritating, they call us to action that requires something of us other than words or nods of encouragement. Their voices require blood. Because along with the voice of Christ that calls us to pour ourselves out like him, the voices of the artists and the wanderers in our midst call us to die for Christ and for his church.
Thanks for watching. Before you go, we'd love to tell you about our new audio documentary.
We've all felt the shock of learning about darkness in places that we thought were safe.
We felt that shock too. Last year, we shared our own stories of spiritual abuse publicly.
Now we're going deeper and Descent into Light, an 8-part audio documentary to explore how adult abuse happens in spiritual settings and how to prevent it.
Listening to this series is for the courageous. It's about hope, but not the easy kind. This is about a hope forged in darkness.
Join us. Together we can face the darkness because God lights the way.
Listen to Descent into Light at sistersofthelittlepway.com or wherever you get your podcasts.